and the leading expert on the geopolitics of undersea spaces, which, by the way, is also the topic of her forthcoming book. Dr. Squire, over to you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you to Duncan for an exceptionally organised event, and to the speakers so far for their comments. It's been really fascinating. I thought I would just begin very briefly just by thinking through a bit more about the term remote, and really to pick up on what was just said there in myth number 7 about the Arctic. I think remote is often a term that we take for granted as simply referring to geographical distance. But as Schweitzer and Porosnek, apologies if I've got that pronunciation wrong, highlight, it can signal a range of states, from somewhere that is hard to access, from isolation to civilization, to wilderness, to cultural distinctiveness. It can be understood as both a positive and negative, depending on who is operationalizing the term. And it's a socially constructed idea that simultaneously opens up and closes a range of possible actions. It can be both a resource or an obstacle, or something in between. It is, in the words of Schweitzer and Porosnek, a social spatial concept rather than a primordial or inert condition. In other words, it's enacted and designated rather than being a naturally occurring state. And I think the designation of remote is also entangled within kind of very problematic histories of colonialism and spatial domination. In my research on the Sea Lab experiments conducted by the US Navy during the Cold War, the remote sea floor was something to be attacked. It was framed as hostile. It was something to be utilized for humankind, regardless of the effects on non-human animal submarine life. Even though, as Sarah Watmore has highlighted, space, however remote it may seem, is always already inhabited. For Schweitzer and Porosnek, similar sensibilities are at play in their research on the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s, who aimed to overcome remoteness and bring civilization to the periphery spaces and what the Soviet Union perceived to be backwards indigenous people. The results of this were extremely detrimental to indigenous peoples, including but not limited to the loss and degradation of traditional herding and hunting land and widespread social isolation. In this instance, modernity and remoteness were constructed at kind of two opposite ends of a pole of modernization. There are lots of other examples we might draw on too. DeAndre Smiles' work on the settler colonial logics of outer space exploration, or Wei et al.'s new work exploring the forgotten and overlooked Maori voyages to Antarctica that occurred long before Western explorers. Within geopolitical scholarship too, the ideas associated with remoteness have come under great scrutiny. The view often associated with the remote is the God's eye view, where scientific instruments, satellite technology, and sensing equipment provide the view from above, disembodied, reaching into faraway places to map and know spaces that are not within physical proximity. This might include discussions on remote warfare, the politics of remote sensing as Mia Bennett explores, or the geopolitics of mapping deep spaces like continental shelves and the sea floor. For some time now, feminist and decolonial scholars have decentered this remote, Western, often masculine scientific gaze. The top-down, disembodied God's eye view, so often associated with such practices, is being critiqued, with arguments for more embodied, ground-level approaches that attend to the realities of everyday human life, non-human life, marginalized peoples, alongside reflecting on questions of care and the ethics, and thinking about those who live outside of Western conceptual frameworks. Any formulation of remote geopolitics, I think, must be attentive to this scholarship and to this turn, and cognizant of the careful approaches that feminist geopolitics and decolonial scholarship embody. So how might we apply this to the deep sea? Well, I think all of these tensions and frictions in kind of comprehending and understanding iterations of remotes are very much present within this space. In many ways, it's the archetype of remoteness as it's conventionally understood within Western discourse. Humans can't survive there without significant technological intervention. It's a space few will ever experience directly. And in many ways, it's kind of difficult to imagine. As is often quoted, we know so little that we don't even yet know what we need to know. This creates a vast space for imaginations, geopolitical and otherwise, to be projected there. And various actors have done just that, often in ways that conform to this kind of top-down God's eye view approach. We have, for example, the Seabed 2030 project, which seeks to map the entire seafloor in the next 9 years. Currently, they've succeeded in mapping 19%, with their remaining 81% to go, which is an area twice the size of Mars remaining. We might think about projects that seek to kind of decenter this top-down view a little bit. This one, for example, by Turner et al., seeking to think through how the deep Atlantic is anything but kind of disembodied, through thinking through how we can memorialize the Atlantic slave trade and the lives that were lost within this deep and unknown space. For the state, maybe we return back to this very dominant scientific God's eye view, things like mapping technologies and various other practices used to bolster state claims, territorial claims, this one being an example from Russia and the continental shelf in the Arctic. Again, for scientists, mapping and visually knowing the remote seafloor is imperative for creating models to forecast future climate change, and the list could be endless. And I guess I'll just end this list by thinking through some of the politics that are involved when thinking about deep space in relation to deep sea mining. For deep sea mining companies, the remoteness of the deep sea represents potential, its potential resources, profits, and kind of fixes to, or so-called fixes to various shortages of minerals and materials on Earth. And then often we will see maps like this from deep sea mining companies that again represent the sea as this kind of flat, empty space that is awaiting exploration, and in this case, exploitation. And yet there are actors at play that complicate these dynamics. John Child's work exploring the prospect of deep sea mining off the coast of Papua New Guinea offers key insights here. The Squire 1 site, which you can see in the map on the screen, was due to be one of the first deep sea mining projects, extracting copper 1,600 meters beneath the surface of the sea. Now, notwithstanding widespread environmental concerns, the Nautilus, who were the company undertaking this, deemed it to be without human consequence due to its remote, or apparently remote, deep location of the operations. The local residents, however, felt very differently. For them, the deep sea was far from being a distant or remote space. On the contrary, Childs explores how it was intricately bound up with who they are, their identity, and their understanding of the world. As one prominent leader representing the 20,000 inhabitants of the Duke of York Islands reported to Childs, the sea is not another world. It is part of Earth. You see people, fish, spirits, volcanoes, what you call land, the sea, it's all connected. We understand that we are at one with the sea, but we are also at one with spirits. If you disturb this world, you're in trouble. The deep sea mining companies, they went on to say, do not understand how people like us connect to something deeper. As one leader also stated, when they start mining the seabed, they'll start mining part of me. And we can see these kind of politics represented in some of these images. This is kind of a classic deep sea mining image. You see technology extending through a relatively blank and empty space of the sea and onto the sea floor, with again, very little human consequence. Then from Childs' research, we can also kind of compare this to one of the drawings that one of his participants made of the kind of sea column and sea floor. And there's the quote that I just mentioned on the right there. You can see that's anything or it's far from being remote. It's not empty. It's teeming with life, spirits, and all kinds of ways of relating to this space that many Western kind of ontologies and ways of thinking would designate as remote and empty. And beyond this, we might also turn to the work of Peters and Steinberg, who highlight how the ocean is never actually very far from us, whether that be in the food we consume, fears of sea level rise, or through films and popular culture that seek to transport audiences beneath the waves. Whilst it is geographically far from the surface on which we live our lives, it interacts with us in ways that we don't always think about. And for Childs, the deep sea and the seabed should be thought of as intimately connected with humanity, despite the geographical distances involved. So just to conclude then, I think remote emerges through the sea as a complex thing. It's remote in the conventional sense, and yet this remoteness is complicated when Western understandings are decentered, and when the many ways that its remoteness creeps into our surface-bound existence are considered. Remote is not singular, and the multifaceted understandings of this term are, I think, what makes it so exciting to explore in relation to the deep sea and beyond. And I think this raises lots of questions which I'll just end on. Which actors are galvanized by the idea of remote, and what are the politics of this process? Who, both human and non-human, are marginalized in this process, and who loses out from this designation of remote? What connections and means of relating to the world are concealed and obscured in designating a space remote? And finally, how can we ethically, inclusively and democratically engage with a space that is already teeming with life, but that we as human beings can't really physically encounter? So thank you very much for your time, and I'll end there.